Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm trying to share my slides. Yes, that looks to be working as well.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk to so many Metaphor colleagues. Today, I'll be talking about a project I'm working on together with colleagues of Radboud Universiteit Medical Center in the Netherlands as well. So let's dive right in since we only have 15 minutes. The background to the project is the fact that in the next decade, the number of people with dementia from migration and ethnic minority groups in the Netherlands is expected to rise twice as quickly as among native Dutch people. So we expect people from these MEM groups to experience more problems with dementia and getting access to healthcare in relation to dementia than native Dutch people. We also know from professional practice that persons with dementia and their families from these MEM groups often receive suboptimal healthcare. Finding access to healthcare is a problem for them, but once they find access to healthcare, they also receive less optimal care than native Dutch people. And we feel that language is an important barrier, both in getting access to healthcare and in receiving optimal healthcare. We know that differences in opinions, perceptions, values, and preferences complicate communication with people with dementia from these groups. It also complicates communication between people with dementia and their family caretakers, and between families and people with dementia and healthcare professionals. So that's the background to this project. The focus for my part of the project especially is to better understand everyday thinking and talking about dementia in terms of metaphors that are used in this culturally diverse group. And the problem is, of course, that we know that this may occur both at the language level and at the conceptual level. So people from these MEM groups may actually have different metaphors at the linguistic level, but they may also have different metaphors at the conceptual level. And it's very hard to distinguish which level we're addressing in our healthcare system. But ultimately, the goal of the project is to make dementia care more person-centered and more culturally sensitive. So we're asking the question, are healthcare professionals using the best metaphors to explain what dementia is and how we should help people with dementia in their everyday lives? So there's a really large project team for the entire project. The main investigators are Anke Oerlemans, Gert Oldhuis, and Marianne Knippenberg, who are involved in the medical side of the project and the ethical side of the project. And my role is mainly to lead the work package that focuses on the language part of the project. So I'm the one who's leading the language analysis, translation, transcription, and metaphor analysis. So the current aim is to identify both linguistic and conceptual metaphors that are used and analyze patterns of metaphor use both within the different MEM groups and across the different MEM groups, and then compare them to how native Dutch speakers use metaphor to talk and think about dementia. So we're interested in finding out, do they use the same metaphors or different ones? And if they use the same ones, do they use them differently? And whether or not they're using the same ones or different ones, do they use these metaphors with different implications and connotations and purposes from what native Dutch speakers do and what healthcare professionals perhaps expect? So the next step of the project will then be for Anke and her team to use these metaphors that we've identified to develop a conversation guide that can be used to facilitate decision-making in these vulnerable groups. And that will be a project similar to what Semino and her colleagues have done with the metaphor menu for metaphors for cancer care. So we're going to try and develop an actual conversation guide for healthcare professionals, offering metaphor alternatives for dementia. All right. So most of you will probably have no problems accepting that we use metaphor to understand and to reason about and to talk about complex phenomena, of which illness is one, and that we use more concrete source domains to understand the abstract domain of dementia and living with dementia. And if you Google dementia, the interesting thing is that you see a kind of visual coherence between the images for dementia you get. There's a very strong focus on the brain, as you can see in all of these images, and there's a very strong sense of loss. And you also see that in verbal instantiations of metaphor for dementia. So there's a sense of people with dementia being lost, but also for families and caretakers, the sense that they lose the person with dementia, that their identity is lost, that they lose bits of themselves, they lose their memories, but also pieces of their identity, that they fade away, that they dissolve into the mist, and that their brain slowly becomes empty. And we were interested in seeing if we also find these kind of dominant metaphors in the interviews with people with dementia from these different members. And we were also interested in seeing whether other dominant metaphors from healthcare, such as the war metaphor that we know from the fight against cancer, but also journey metaphors as an alternative to war metaphors, and space metaphors, direction metaphors, location metaphors, container metaphors. We were interested in seeing whether these people use those metaphors to talk about dementia specifically. So the planned methodology was to have 12 focus group interviews for each of the groups with 5 to 8 informal caregivers. And the interviews were to be conducted in the native tongues of the participants, moderated by bilingual moderators, and then analyzed by bilingual analysts. So transcribed and then analyzed for metaphor. And the specific mem groups we were interested in the Netherlands are the Chinese who speak Cantonese predominantly, Turkish, Moroccan with Berber, and sometimes Arabic, Surinamese, who use Sranan Tongo, and Dutch Antillean with Papiamentu. And then we also had a Dutch native kind of control group to see if they actually also did the same thing as has been argued in the literature. Now, this is where it immediately became problematic because recruitment itself was problematic. There was so much shame and stigma surrounding dementia that most of the possible participants we approached through our networks, working with migration groups, vulnerable groups, and the elderly, participants said that they wanted to collaborate, but they were afraid that other people in their cultural network would find out that they have someone in their family with dementia. So there was so much shame and stigma that we, for certain groups, such as the Moroccan Berber group, it was impossible to hold focus groups because these people wanted to stay anonymous. They didn't want anyone in their cultural network to know that they were caring for someone with dementia. And the other problem was that we quickly found that it was hard to have interviews with people with dementia because they either were often in the stage that they were denying the fact that it was dementia, or they were already, in a sense, too far gone and they couldn't reflect anymore on what it meant for them to have dementia. So we used their caretakers as proxies. But that, of course, means that we had kind of indirect access to these metaphors for dementia through the caretaker rather than directly through the person with dementia. In the end, we ended up with 7 focus groups. For the Turkish groups, the Cantonese groups, and the Dutch groups, we had 2. For the Surinamese group, we had 1. And the other interviews were all individual interviews. So 9 for Berber, 2 for Papiamentu, and 2 for Sranan Tongo. This also meant that there was a huge time difference between the interviews and the focus groups, with the shortest interview being only 70 minutes and the longest focus group being 96 minutes. So we're not going to focus on quantitative results because it's hard to compare focus groups to individual interviews and to compare percentages across interviews that are so widely different in the number of speakers and the number of minutes. So the interviews were audio recorded, then transcribed and translated directly or word by word into Dutch. And then they were analyzed both in terms of the original language, the heritage language, and Dutch in terms of a multilingual MIPVU approach. And then we determined patterns following Cameron's kind of emergent dynamic metaphor analysis. And one problem here, of course, is that most of these languages, Cantonese, Papiamentu, and Berber, are spoken languages, so they lack codification and they don't have fixed dictionaries, for instance, which makes the application of MIPVU very difficult. So, as for some general results, we found far fewer metaphors than expected. Given Steen et al.'s work that 1 in every 8 words is metaphorical, we found fewer. And I think that might be because the focus in these interviews was on telling anecdotes of actual behavior, of what people looked like, did, and where they were when things happened. So there was a focus on the actual literal surroundings and literal actions of people, and very little metaphorical reflection on those actions and behaviors. The metaphors we did find were rarely original, rarely deliberate, and rarely used to explore the meaning of the metaphor. So they were kind of used automatically, as you would expect from Lakoff Johnson's work. There were also fewer metaphors for the target domain of brains and heads and minds than you would expect. So while we find so many images for dementia that focus on the brain and parts of the brain disappearing, there were very few references to brains and heads and minds in these interviews, which suggests that there's something to be won here to instruct these people to focus more on this part of the illness, the fact that it is an illness of the brain. And in fact, most of the MEM groups argued that in their particular culture, dementia isn't recognized as an illness. Most people don't actually believe that it exists as a medical condition. There was a striking absence of both war and journey metaphors, but there was a recurrent use of child and insanity or insane person metaphors. So for the war metaphors, which we were expecting, similar to fighting the war on cancer, the only group that used war metaphors was the Dutch group. And when they used them, they actually used them to talk about the process of the fight between the person with dementia and their caretakers, the fight of the person with dementia to accept the diagnosis. So they resist the diagnosis. And when they finally accept the diagnosis, this is formulated as surrendering to the diagnosis. And also the fight of people with dementia against changes to their daily lives. So they talked about people resisting being put in a nursing home. So rather than a fight against the disease, it's a fight against your caretakers and the diagnosis. For journeys, we've also found it problematic to say whether these metaphors are actually journey metaphors or movement metaphors or direction metaphors. But what we did find was that 2 of them were recurring across all of the groups. And that was the metaphor of being too far gone or being far away, and the metaphor of going backwards. So there is a sense of movement, direction, but very limited in its use. It's always movement backwards or a state of being too far gone. And I personally think this is probably because journeys tend to be meaningful experiences and something we do intentionally. And this is kind of countered by the illness trajectory of dementia, where once you have dementia, you've actually lost the fight and the journey is over. There's a kind of point of no return. And the only way you're moving is down or backwards. So it's not a kind of meaningful experience. You don't choose a different direction or choose a new road. At least that's what the metaphors used by these people suggest. There was only one reference to journey metaphors, again in the Dutch group, where they explore that it's a very kind of negative journey, not one you take voluntarily, and that it's actually, again, the caretakers who take the journey rather than the person with dementia. So the caretakers do feel that they're in a dementia journey, but not necessarily the person with dementia themselves. And then finally, the child and insanity metaphors. These occur across all of the MEM groups. And our team has found that they're quite problematic in terms of the framing they cause. They're used to frame typical dementia behavior, such as asking repetitive questions, telling repetitive stories, having tantrums, aggression, fits, crying, but also being sweet and stealing food, for instance. And you see different entailments per MEM group. So the Chinese talk a lot about people with dementia in terms of being naughty children who cheat at games and steal food. Whereas, especially in the Turkish group, the child metaphor seems to be used to counter another dominant metaphor, which is dementia is a punishment from Allah. So they emphasize innocence, that the person with dementia is an innocent baby, that you need to nurture them and love them. And we feel that both the insanity metaphor and the child metaphor therefore have an important disempowerment effect. You take away the person with dementia's right to decide, to act, to determine what they want, because you would never allow a child or an insane person to decide for themselves what they want to do. So we feel that this project will hopefully contribute in making sure that in these MEM groups, we acknowledge dementia as a medical condition rather than simply old age or weird, crazy behavior. That healthcare professionals realize that it really is taboo to talk about people with dementia or dementia in these groups. That the war and journey metaphors may not be useful for them, given the illness trajectory of dementia itself. That there are important implications of using child and insanity metaphors in these groups as they disempower the people with dementia. And then we need to be on the lookout for negative metaphors, such as dementia is a punishment, people with dementia are possessed by evil spirits, or people with dementia are insane. And that we need to explore alternative metaphors, particularly in terms of the brain, which is the key element of dementia. So to wrap it up, we feel we need to address the taboo and stigma surrounding dementia, and we need to do more cross-linguistic and cross-cultural research to find out which metaphors are helping and which metaphors are hindering people with dementia and their caretakers. And there may actually be a need to reframe our discourse on dementia. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't open my phone. You can ask question now. We have 1 or 2 minutes for question.